Okay, so another major takeaway from Leviticus 14 is honestly something people still struggle with today. Just because healing starts doesn't mean everything instantly goes back to normal. And honestly, that's such a needed conversation because when you read this full chapter, something really stands out. The person was healed, but they still weren't immediately restored back into everyday life. Like, there was still a process. There was waiting, washing, checking, preparation, more waiting, and gradual re-entry into the community. At first, that can sound super harsh or confusing, especially if you're not familiar with biblical culture. But the deeper point is actually really wise. God was teaching people that healing and restoration are connected, but they are not always the same thing. Think about it like this. If someone breaks a bone, the break can technically heal, but that doesn't mean you immediately run a marathon the next morning. There's physical therapy, there's rebuilding strength, there's learning stability again. That's basically the vibe of Leviticus 14, spiritually and emotionally. The visible problem may have improved, but God still cared about the person being fully restored in a healthy, sustainable way. And honestly, that's kind of comforting because so many people today feel pressured to bounce back immediately after heartbreak, burnout, addiction, betrayal, grief, depression, failure, public embarrassment, toxic relationships. Like, society is basically, okay, you're better now, right? Cool, moving on. But this chapter says no. Real restoration can take time. And one thing that keeps showing up in this chapter is the number 7. There are multiple 7-day waiting periods. Now, if you're not familiar with the Bible, 7 is a super symbolic number in scripture. It usually represents completeness, fullness, spiritual maturity, and a process reaching its proper end, fulfillment. So the waiting wasn't random. God was intentionally building pauses into the restoration process, which honestly feels so opposite from modern culture. Because today everything is instant healing, instant trust, instant closure, instant success, instant comeback story. But Leviticus is like, actually, slow healing is still healing. And wow, that matters. That's why verses like Ecclesiastes 3:1 connect so well. To everything there is a season. That verse gets used a lot, but in this context, it makes so much sense. Because Leviticus 14 is literally structured in stages. God could have just said, once the disease is gone, immediately return. But he didn't. There were seasons inside the healing. And that's important because sometimes people think delays automatically mean failure. Biblically, not necessarily. Sometimes a slower process is actually a healthier one. Then there's Galatians 6:9. Do not grow weary in doing good. That verse fits because restoration can honestly feel exhausting sometimes, especially when you're in that weird middle stage where you're not who you used to be anymore, but your life doesn't fully feel rebuilt yet either. And Leviticus 14 spends a lot of time in that middle space, that in-between space, not fully isolated anymore, not fully regenerated yet either. And honestly, a lot of people live there emotionally. Then there's Psalms 40, where David said, I waited patiently for the Lord. And that connects because biblical restoration often involves trust during the waiting. Not passive waiting, not doing nothing, but trusting that growing is still happening, even when everything isn't instantly complete. And I think one of the biggest misunderstandings people have about God is thinking he only values quick results. But Leviticus 14 shows something really different. God values thorough restoration. Not rush restoration, not performative restoration, not fake I'm fine restoration. Real restoration. The kind that's stable, healthy, deep, sustainable. And honestly, that's such a word for modern life because sometimes people get discouraged thinking, why am I still rebuilding? Why is this taking so long? Why don't I feel fully whole yet? But this chapter quietly reminds us the middle stage is not meaningless. Just because restoration takes time does not mean it isn't happening. Sometimes the waiting is part of what makes the healing real.